This video lesson is to introduce you to the writing of a prominent African American poet at the turn of the century, Paul Laurence Dunbar. As you can see, he didn't live a very long life, but his work is fascinating. Just as a debrief, we are still looking at realism in American literature. We've looked at regional writers, we've looked at local color writers, and we have looked at writers of naturalist, American literary naturalism. And today we're looking at a writer of African American literature. So far, one of the things that I want to point out is that the texts that we have been reading, and this is characteristic of what was happening more broadly during this time frame, is that we're seeing an increase in the diversity of the subjects or the people, the characters, and the regions in the writing that we're encountering. So Walt Whitman, if you'll think back to, section 15 of Song of Myself, he's got that lengthy catalog of all kinds of individuals that represent, every corner and pocket of the American population. Then you've got Emily Dickinson's poetry is really kind of telescoped into one person's perspective. Mark Twain set the notorious jumping frog of Calaveras County at a mining camp in the West, and of course he has a lot of other regional and local color writing. Kate Chopin set Desiree's Baby in the antebellum South. Mary E. Wilkins Freeman has her story set in a small East Coast town. Zitkala Shaw, her text is set in an Indian reservation, and then Jack London's text is set in the Yukon wilderness, while Dreiser's novel is set in urban Chicago. So you can see we have a nice wide range of locations, settings, and the kinds of characters that we meet in these different settings are not stock characters, or they're not one character. They represent many different walks of life. But another thing that I want to point out is that with the exception of one of these writers, every single author is a white writer who is depicting one of these marginalized or lesser known groups in the American population. Everybody that we've read so far, with the exception of Zitkala Shaw, is a white writer depicting a marginalized culture. Now, Zitkala Shaw is different because she is representing her own experience. Paul Laurence Dunbar is another in this kind of writing that is depicting his own population most of the time. I want to begin by giving you a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois's text that you're going to read a little bit later, but I think that it is appropriate to look at as an introduction to Dunbar's writing as well. Du Bois writes, "It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness." I think what Du Bois is trying to say is that he doesn't only view himself the way that he views himself, but he also views himself the way that others who are very different than him view him. And he almost kind of has to adopt that other identity in his understanding of himself. And he writes about that. He goes on to say, that two-ness is that I'm an American and I'm also a minority. I'm two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Daigle writes of Dunbar that black artists were largely invisible to white Americans until the mid-1890s, when ragtime exploded, minstrel stars sold millions of copies of their sheet music, and Paul Laurence Dunbar rose to national prominence. Um, Many times when I'm teaching this class in person, I'm able to show images of sheet music that was written for black minstrel shows. And if you have some time to do a web search for black minstrel shows, I think that you'll be very interested to see what they're all about. But they were these entertainment programs, and they were basically white people performing in blackface, and they were um, caricaturizing the black culture. And the music that they sang was written by a range of composers, but some of the music that was performed in these black minstrel shows was by Paul Laurence Dunbar. So, as you can see, Daigle goes on to point out that Dunbar was considered the prince of coon songs. Those are Daigle's words, and he was hailed as the Black Poet Laureate. So he was well known for this songwriting, and also for his poetry. He had published a lot in the short time that he was alive, and he wrote in a range of dialects. And I want to show you this poem. It's called Lagerbier, and it is written in a German dialect. I'm going to try to render it. I laughs and sings und jumps around und sometimes act so queer. You ask me what der Matter is? I'm filled mit Lagerbier. So many times I show students this poem and ask them who they think the poet is, and of course they're going to guess like a German immigrant or something like that. But this is actually a poem written by Dunbar, who is doing kind of what Mark Twain does. Mark Twain, when he is depicting Huck Finn and Jim, he uses these different dialects of these different people in order to help us better see them the way that they spoke and interacted with one another. But Twain himself was not a slave, but he does use dialect to render and to help us see Jim and hear Jim speak. And that's kind of what Paul Laurence Dunbar is doing here. He's taking on the persona of a German, yet he himself is a black writer. So he was very skilled at using dialect, not just the dialect of his own ethnicity, but of kind of entering into the mindset and the way of speaking of different cultures and different social groups. These are some lines from an antebellum sermon, and we'll look more at this poem later, but here you have the dialect of a slave preacher who is holding a secret and prohibited church service out in the woods. So you can, when you read his poetry many times, and also in these songs that he wrote for the black minstrel shows, his lyrics, his verse, his language often employs a genial or breezy tone, and it makes it seem simplistic and actually caused a lot of people to be critical of him because of the way that they believed that he was caricaturizing his own people. But what the author Headnote points out in your anthology is that there's actually a good bit of complexity and subtlety in his writing, and that's what I want to talk about today. So, also the Headnote pointed out that he was criticized in the late 1920s, that he was catering to a white audience, and that he was stereotyping black folk elements and dialect. So he's appropriating this regional idiom, and he's representing blacks in literature, but he's doing it not to make them look unintelligent or to kind of minimize the fullness of their identity, but instead to send perhaps a more subtle message. Now, during this time frame, if a black writer wanted to speak into an environment that was obviously not supportive of their culture and their identity, the black writer could either use direct protest or could use indirect protest. And Dunbar not only engaged in direct protest, as we'll see later, but he also celebrates in his writing actual historical figures and leaders who themselves were engaged in direct protest. So he's got the poem celebrating Frederick Douglass, who was a very outspoken leader in our country about uh, civil rights. Um, and then he also has a poem about Harriet Beecher Stowe, where he's celebrating the way that she speaks out against injustice. Dunbar also participates in less direct protest. His poem Sympathy kind of has the central metaphor of a bird in a cage. And actually, I believe it's Maya Angelou wrote a novel later that that is titled after this poem. But it's a very well crafted poem that is really pointing out the difficulties of a person who is part of an ethnicity that is living a life that is much like being a bird in a cage. So there you've got this indirect protest. The poem depicts an experience that can be a universal human experience, but is also particular to the Black experience in America. There's more indirect protest in his poem, We Wear the Mask. And again, similar to Sympathy, the poem We Wear the Mask is a universal poem. Anyone can say at any given time that he or she, is wearing a mask, is having to take on an identity in order to be accepted or to be successful. Many people often feel that they're hidden, that their true self is hidden. So in that way, the poem is successful and anthologized because it captures the broader universal human experience. It also captures the experience of an artist. If you think of a work of art, a text, a painting, a song, a sculpture, if you think of a work of art as a mask, then this poem also captures the experience of any kind of artist. Think of an actor who puts on a mask in order to play a role. But the poem, again, similar to Sympathy, also captures the experience of any individual who is part of a marginalized group in our population. So there's the poem in its whole. And I'll let you pause the video and read it to yourself. Hopefully you can see how this poem just captures the experience of a person who feels hidden and who is suffering kind of behind this mask, pretending to be happy, pretending to be okay, yet behind the mask, smiling and then behind the mask, crying to God from tortured souls. So you get the idea of indirect protest here, but I also want to point out that this poem is also subversive. And here's what I mean by that. This poem is celebrating the idea that donning a mask and taking on an alternative identity is intended to deceive the person who's looking at that mask. And it asks the question, why should someone who's suffering make his or her suffering known to people who are going to disregard or mistreat that person? Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. So this poem is, again, celebrating the human experience, but also pointing out that when a person takes on an artificial identity, it is for the purpose of hiding something as a way of self-protecting and also as a way of pushing back against the mistreatment. So I want to go back to Du Bois's quote because it touches again on this idea of having two identities, the double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. That is why Dunbar is writing about putting on a mask because he and the speaker in the poem is aware that the suffering that's behind the mask is only going to be treated with amusement, as the audiences of the Black minstrel shows demonstrated, and contempt, which was, very clearly expressed and acted on by the dominant culture at this time frame, and one would argue continuing on today. So one ever feels his two-ness, an American, which is sort of the mask, but then also a Negro. Du Bois was a prominent African American thinker, writer. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And I would argue that Dunbar in his writing demonstrates this strength. And I want to show you a little bit more about how he does that in the antebellum sermon. So, the setting for this poem, as I mentioned before, is out in the woods, and it's a group of slaves and a slave preacher who is preaching a sermon to these people. They're not supposed to be having church, they're not supposed to be gathering. He's certainly not supposed to be preaching, but that's the speaker in the poem, and that's the setting. It goes something like this. And the land shall hear his thunder like a blast from Gabriel's horn, for the Lord of hosts is mighty when he girds his armor on. But for fear some mistakes me, I will pause right here to say that I'm still a preaching ancient. I ain't talking about today. Now don't run and tell your masters that I's preaching discontent. So what the preacher is saying here is that I'm talking about what's happening in the Bible, what's happening in the Old Testament, and of course he's preaching from a part of the Bible that portrays the Egyptians and Pharaoh oppressing the Israelites. And what the preacher is doing is he's likening the slave experience to the Israelites, and he's likening implicitly the white slave owners with the Pharaoh. But he doesn't say that out loud, and he wants to make sure that the people who are gathering for this secret worship service, the secret church service, that they're not going to go back and tell their masters that he's trying to tell them that they should do what the Israelites did. But later in the poem, he describes how Moses, who is the leader of the Israelites in this Old Testament text, actually frees his people. But when Moses with his power comes and sets us children free, we will praise the gracious master that has given us liberty. And we'll shout our hallelujahs on that mighty reckoning day when we's recognized as citizens. And then he cuts himself off. Children, let us pray. That's how this poem ends. So what the preacher is doing is he's celebrating and talking about how Moses manages to freeze the Israelites, and right before they're about to become citizens themselves, not under the thumb and the torture and the oppression of Pharaoh and his government, he cuts himself off, because if he goes all the way and points out that Moses and the Israelites are free, it would be very easy if this word got back to the slave owners. It would be very easy for him to be punished for preaching some kind of rebellion against slavery and the slave owners. So right before he gets to that point, he says, "Oh, children, let us pray," and that's how the poem ends. So what you have is a preacher who's preaching a sermon to encourage his audience, which is the slaves, to take hope in the fact that they too are going to become citizens. So he's kind of cultivating their desire to be free, which of course would have been punished terribly by slave owners during this time. So in the head note, a letter that Dunbar wrote is quoted, where he says that his goal is to interpret his own people through song and story and to prove to the many that we are more human than African. He's trying to depict their human experience and trying to, I guess, shatter this view that perhaps the white dominant culture has of blacks during this time as being minimized or minimal or less than because of their race, and instead depict the depth and the breadth of the African American individual. So, Dunbar's poem is set in a particular region. It has a setting, and that way it's very similar to local color and regional writing. He uses dialect. Um, he also is depicting marginalized populations in his poetry. And I guess that's a question that I leave with you. Does his writing cater to his white audience? Is he just trying to continue playing to this stereotyped identity that white readers, who are the people, frankly, who are buying his poetry, is he just catering to this audience? Is he betraying his own ethnic community by kind of forwarding and perpetuating these stereotypes? Or by depicting characters who are subversively or directly or indirectly protesting oppression, is he doing that himself through his art? Is Dunbar's writing subversive of white dominant culture? And if so, is he doing it subtly? Is he doing it explicitly? Or is he not subverting the white dominant culture and instead is he perpetuating it? Those are questions that I want to leave you with today. Thanks for listening.